Under the Whyte notation for the classification of steam locomotives, 060 represents the wheel arrangement of no leading wheels, 6 powered and coupled driving wheels on 3 axles, and no trailing wheels. This was the most common wheel arrangement used on both tender and tank locomotives in versions with both inside and outside cylinders. In the UIC classification, popular in Europe, the same arrangement is written as C if the wheels are coupled with rods or gears, or CO if they are independently driven. In the United Kingdom, the Whyte notation of wheel arrangement was also often used for the classification of electric and diesel-electric locomotives with side rod, coupled driving wheels. Other equivalent classifications are UIC classification C, French locomotive classification 030, Turkish locomotive classification 33, Swiss classification 3/3, Russian classification 030. Overview. History. The 060 configuration was the most widely used wheel arrangement for both tender and tank steam locomotives. The type was also widely used for diesel switches, because they lack leading and trailing wheels. Locomotives of this type have all the weight pressing down on the driving wheels and consequently have a high tractive effort and factor of adhesion, making them comparatively strong engines for the size, weight and fuel consumption. On the other hand, the lack of unpowered leading wheels have the result that 060 locomotives are less stable at speed, so they are mostly used on trains where high speed is unnecessary. Since 060 tender engines can pull fairly heavy trains, albeit slowly, the type was commonly used to pull short and medium-distance freight trains such as pick-up goods trains along both main and branch lines. The tank engine versions were widely used as switching locomotives since the smaller 040 types were not large enough to be versatile in this job. 080 and larger switching locomotives, on the other hand, were too big to be economical or even usable on lightly built railways such as dockyards and goods yards, precisely the sorts of places where switching locomotives were most needed. The earliest 060 locomotives had outside cylinders, as these were simpler to construct and maintain. However, once designers began to overcome the problem of the breakage of the crank axles, inside cylinder versions were found to be more stable. Thereafter this pattern was widely adopted, particularly in the UK, although outside cylinder versions were also widely used. Tank engine versions of the type began to be built in the mid-1850s and had become very common by the mid-1860s. Early examples 060 locomotives were among the first types to be used. The earliest recorded example was the Royal George, built by Timothy Hackworth for the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825. Other early examples included the Vulcan, the first inside-cylinder type, built by Charles Taylor and Company in 1835 for the Leicester and Swannington Railway, and Hector, a long boiler locomotive built by Kitson and Company in 1845 for the York and North Midland Railway. Derwent, built in 1845 by William and Alfred Kitching for the Stockton and Darlington Railway, is preserved at Darlington Railway Centre and Museum. Usage. All the major continental European railways used 060s of one sort or another, though usually not in the proportions used in the United Kingdom. As in the United States, European 060 locomotives were largely restricted to switching and station pilot duties, though they were also widely used on short branch lines to haul passenger and freight trains. On most branch lines, though, larger and more powerful tank engines tended to be favored. Australia. In New South Wales, the Z19 class was a tender type with this wheel arrangement, as was the Victorian Railways Whyte class. The Dorrigo Railway Museum collection includes 7 locomotives of the 060 wheel arrangement, including 2 Z19 class, 3 060 saddle tanks and 2 060 side tanks. Finland tank locomotives used by Finland were the VR class VR1 and VR class VR4. The VR class VR1s were numbered 530 to 544, 656 to 670 and 787 to 799. They had outside cylinders and were operational from 1913 to 1975. Built by Tampere, Finland and Hanomag, they were nicknamed Chicken. Number 669 is preserved at the Finnish Railway Museum. The VR4s were a class of only 4 locomotives, numbered 1400 to 1423, originally built as 060s by Vulcan Ironworks, USA, but modified to 062s in 1951 to 1955, and reclassified as VR5. Finland's tender locomotives were the classes C1, C2, C3, C4, C5 and C6. The Finnish steam locomotive class C1s were a class of 10 locomotives numbered 21 to 30. They were operational from 1869 to 1926. They were built by Nielsen and Company and were nicknamed Bristolari. Number 21, preserved at the Finnish Railway Museum, is the second oldest preserved locomotive in Finland. The 18 class C2s were numbered 31 to 43 and 48 to 52. They were also nicknamed Bristolari. The C3 was a class of only 2 locomotives, numbered 74 and 75. The 13 class C4s were numbered 62 and 78 to 89. The 14 Finnish steam locomotive class C5s were numbered 101 to 114. They were operational from 1881 to 1930. They were built by Hanomag in Hanover and were nicknamed Blixt. Number 110 is preserved at the Finnish Railway Museum. The C6 was a solitary class of 1 locomotive, numbered 100. New Zealand. In New Zealand, the 060 design was restricted to tank engines. The Hunslet built M class of 1874 and Y class of 1923 provided 7 examples. However, the F class built between 1872 and 1888 was the most prolific, surviving the entire era of NZR steam operations, with 88 examples of which 8 were preserved. South Africa Cape Gauge. In 1876, the Cape Government Railways placed a pair of 060 Stephenson's patent permanently coupled back-to-back tank locomotives in service on the Cape Eastern system. They worked out of East London in comparative trials with the experimental 060 plus 060 Fairlie locomotive that was acquired in that same year. The Natal Harbours Department placed a single 060 saddle tank locomotive in service in 1879, named John Milne. The Natal Government Railways placed a single locomotive in shunting service in 1880, later designated Class K, virtually identical to the Durban Harbour's John Milne and built by the same manufacturer. In 1882, 2 060 tank locomotives entered service on the private Cowie Railway between Grahamstown and Port Alfred. Both locomotives were rebuilt to a 4-4-0T wheel arrangement in 1884. In 1890, the Nederlandse Zuid-Afrikaanse Spoorwegmaatschappij of the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republic placed 6 18-tonner 060 St locomotives in service. On construction work, in 1896 and 1897, 3 26-tonner saddle tank locomotives were built for the Pretoria near Petersburg Railway by Hawthorne, Leslie and Company. These were the first locomotives to be obtained by the then recently established PPR. Two of these, named Nyström and Petersburg, came into SAR stock in 1912 and survived into the 1940s. In 1901, a single 060T harbour locomotive built by Hudswell Clark was delivered to the Harbours Department of Natal. It was named Edward Innes and retained this name when it was taken onto the SAR roster in 1912. Two saddle tank locomotives were supplied to the East London Harbour Board in 1902, built by Hunslet. Both survived until the 1930s, well into the SAR era. In 1904, a single saddle tank harbour locomotive, named Sir Albert, was built by Hunslet for the Harbours Department of Natal. It came into SAR stock in 1912 and was withdrawn in 1915. Narrow gauges. In 1871, two 2 feet 6 in gauge tank locomotives built by the Lilleshall Company of Oaken Gates, Shropshire in 1870 and 1871, were placed in service by the Cape of Good Hope Copper Mining Company, named John King and Miner. They were the first steam locomotives to enter service on the hitherto mule-powered Namaqualand Railway between Portnolloth and the Namaqualand copper mines around Ookeep in the Cape Colony. In 1902, Arthur Coppell, acting as agent, imported a single 060 feet narrow-gauge tank steam locomotive for a customer in Durban. It was then purchased by the Cape Government Railways and used as construction locomotive on the Avontuur branch from 1903. In 1912, this locomotive was assimilated into the South African Railways, and in 1917 it was sent to German Southwest Africa during the First World War campaign in the territory, Southwest Africa, between 1898 and 1905. More than 50 pairs of Zwillinge twin-tank steam locomotives were acquired by the Swakopmund Windhoekstaatsbahn in Deutsch West Africa. Zwillinge locomotives were a class of small 600 mm Schmillspur 060T tank steam locomotives that were built in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As indicated by the name Zwillinge, they were designed to be used in pairs, semi-permanently coupled back-to-back at the cabs, allowing a single footplate crew to fire and control both locomotives. The pairs of locomotives shared a common manufacturer's works number and engine number, with the units being designated as A and B. By 1922, when the SAR took control of all railway operations in Southwest Africa, only two single-Zwillinge locomotives survived to be absorbed onto the roster of the SAR. In 1907, the German administration in DSWA acquired three Class HC tank locomotives for the narrow-gauge Otavi Mining and Railway Company. One more entered service in 1910, and another was obtained by the South African Railways in 1929. In 1911, the Luderitzbert Eisenbahn placed two Cape Gauge 060T locomotives in service as shunting engines. They were apparently no longer in service when all railways in the territory came under the administration of the South African Railways in 1922. Switzerland. During the Second World War, Switzerland converted some 060 shunting engines into electric steam locomotives. United Kingdom. The 060 tender locomotive type was extremely common in Britain for more than a century and was still being built in large numbers during the 1940s. Between 1858 and 1872, 943 examples of the John Ramsbottom DX goods class were built by the London and North Western Railway and the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. This was the earliest example of standardization and mass production of locomotives. Of the total stock of standard gauge locomotives operating on British railways in 1900, around 20,000 engines, over a third were 060 tender types. The ultimate British 060 was the Q1 austerity type, developed by the Southern Railway during the Second World War to haul very heavy freight trains. It was the most powerful steam 060 design produced in Europe. Similarly, the 060 tank locomotives became the most common locomotive type on all railways throughout the 20th century. All of the Big Four companies to emerge from the Railways Act 1921 grouping used them in vast numbers. The Great Western Railway, in particular, had many of the type, most characteristically in the form of the pannier tank locomotive that remained in production well past railway nationalization in 1948. When diesel shunters began to be introduced, the 060 type became the most common. Many of the British Railways shunter types were 060s, including Class 03, the Standard Light Shunter, and Class 08 and Class 09, the Standard Heavier Shunters. United States of America. In the United States, huge numbers of 060 locomotives were produced, with the majority of them being used as switches. The USRA 060 was the smallest of the USRA standard classes designed and produced during the brief government control of the railroads through the USRA during the First World War. 255 of them were built and ended up in the hands of about 24 U.S. railroads. In addition, many of the railroads built numerous copies after the war. The Pennsylvania Railroad rostered over 1,200 060 types over the years, which were classed as Type B on that system. The U.S. 060s were generally tender locomotives. During the Second World War, no fewer than 514 U.S. ATCS 100 Class 060 tank engines were built by the Davenport Locomotive Works, for use by the United States Army Transportation Corps in both Europe and North Africa. Some of these remained in service long after the war, having been purchased or otherwise adopted by the countries where they were used. These included Austria, Egypt, France, Iraq, the United Kingdom and Yugoslavia. The 14 engines purchased by the Southern Railway in 1946 remained in service well into the 1960s. Designed to be extremely strong but easy to maintain, these engines had a very short wheelbase that allowed them to operate on dockyard railways. Suffixes. For a steam tank locomotive, the suffix usually indicates the type of tank. Tanks, 060T, side tanks. 060 street, saddle tank. 060PT, pannier tanks. 060WT, well tank. Other steam locomotive suffixes include 060VB, vertical boiler. 060F, fireless locomotive. 060G, geared steam locomotive. For a diesel locomotive, the suffix indicates the transmission type 0 to 6-0 German marks mechanical transmission. 060DH, hydraulic transmission. 060D, electric transmission.